Samuel Rodriguez adjusted his worn leather jacket as he walked through the bustling airport terminal. At 73 years old, his steps were slower than they once were, but his back remained straight with the dignity that came from decades of military service. The small bronze medal pinned to his jacket caught the fluorescent lights overhead, though most people hurrying past barely noticed the elderly man making his way to gate B12. The medal wasn't much to look at compared to the flashy jewelry and designer accessories worn by other travelers. It was simple, tarnished with age, and attached to a faded ribbon that had seen better days. But to Samuel, it represented the most important moment of his life, a moment that had changed him forever and saved the lives of 7 fellow soldiers during the Vietnam War. Samuel had been drafted at 19, fresh out of high school in a small Texas town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He wasn't particularly brave or strong, just an ordinary young man who loved baseball and helped his father fix cars in their garage. The war seemed like something happening in a distant world until the letter arrived, summoning him to serve his country. The flight to Los Angeles was part of a journey he had been planning for months. His grandson Michael was graduating from college, the first in their family to earn a degree. Samuel had promised to be there no matter what. The old veteran had saved every penny from his modest pension to afford the plane ticket, choosing to fly rather than drive because his arthritis made long car trips too painful. As he settled into his economy seat, Samuel noticed the looks from other passengers. Some seemed annoyed by how slowly he moved down the aisle. Others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps wondering why an old man was traveling alone. A few young business travelers rolled their eyes when he took extra time storing his small carry-on bag overhead. The seat next to him was occupied by a well-dressed woman in her 40s who immediately pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Across the aisle, 2 college-age students snickered as they watched Samuel struggle slightly with his seatbelt. The buckle was different from the ones he was used to, and his fingers weren't as nimble as they once were. "Need help there, Grandpa?" one of the students called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His friend laughed and pointed at Samuel's medal. "Nice costume jewelry. Did you get that at a thrift store?" Samuel's face flushed red, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially with people who couldn't possibly understand what real fighting meant. Instead, he quietly fastened his seatbelt and opened the small paperback book he had brought for the flight. The woman next to him glanced over and noticed the title, a biography of soldiers who served in Vietnam. She wrinkled her nose slightly and shifted away as if the topic might be contagious. Behind them, a businessman talking loudly on his phone complained about being seated near some old guy with his war medals who was probably going to tell boring stories the whole flight. More passengers continued boarding, and the comments grew bolder. A group of young professionals near the back made jokes about stolen valor and questioned whether the medal was even real. They speculated about whether Samuel was just an old man seeking attention, wearing military decorations he hadn't earned. The flight attendants were too busy with their pre-flight duties to notice the growing tension. Samuel tried to focus on his book, but the words blurred together as memories of Vietnam flooded back. He remembered the jungle heat, the constant fear, the faces of friends who never made it home. Most of all, he remembered the day that earned him the Bronze Star with Valor, the day he crawled through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers from a burning helicopter. As the plane filled up, Samuel noticed a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit walking down the aisle. The man moved with confidence and purpose, nodding politely to flight attendants who seemed to recognize him. He took a seat several rows ahead, in the business class section that Samuel could never afford. The elderly veteran closed his eyes and tried to block out the whispers and snickers around him. He thought about Michael, his grandson, who had always looked up to him and never questioned the stories about his military service. Michael believed in him, respected him, and that was enough. That had to be enough. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would begin taxiing shortly. Samuel gripped his book tighter and prepared for what he assumed would be a long, uncomfortable flight filled with sideways glances and whispered comments about the old man with the fake medal. He had no idea that everything was about to change. He couldn't have known that the distinguished man in business class had been watching and listening to everything that happened. Most importantly, Samuel had no way of knowing that this man would soon stand up and transform his humiliating experience into one of the most meaningful moments of his life. The plane began to move away from the gate, and Samuel stared out the small window at the ground crew below. He wondered if he had made a mistake coming on this trip. Maybe he should have just sent Michael a card and stayed home. The metal on his jacket suddenly felt heavier, like a burden rather than an honor. But sometimes the most important moments in life come when we least expect them. Sometimes respect and recognition arrive from the most unlikely sources. And sometimes one person's courage to stand up for what's right can change everything for someone who has quietly carried their pain for far too long. The journey was just beginning, and Samuel Rodriguez was about to discover that his service to his country, and the sacrifice it represented, had not been forgotten by everyone after all. As the airplane climbed to cruising altitude, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a long flight. Passengers pulled out laptops, books, and tablets, preparing to pass the time. But for Samuel Rodriguez, the journey was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the attention on his Bronze Star medal grew more pointed and cruel. The two college students across the aisle had apparently decided that Samuel was their entertainment for the flight. They leaned toward each other, whispering just loudly enough for him to hear their comments. The taller one, wearing an expensive university sweatshirt, pointed discreetly at the medal and shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "I can't believe people actually do that," he said to his friend, his voice carrying a tone of superiority that came from youth and privilege. "My grandfather was a real veteran, and he would be disgusted by someone pretending like that." His companion, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, nodded in agreement. "It's so pathetic. Like, what does he think he's going to accomplish? Does he expect people to thank him for his fake service?" Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he turned a page in his book, though he hadn't read a single word in the past 10 minutes. The comments cut deeper than he expected. After all these years, after all the therapy sessions to deal with survivor's guilt and the nightmares that still came sometimes, he thought he had developed thick skin. But being called a fake in front of a plane full of strangers brought back feelings of shame and inadequacy he thought he had overcome. The businessman behind him had finished his phone call and apparently overheard the students' conversation. Instead of defending Samuel or asking them to be quiet, he decided to join in. "You know what the real problem is?" he announced to anyone within earshot. "These stolen valor cases are becoming epidemic. People buy fake medals online and then expect special treatment. It's disgusting." A woman in the row ahead turned around to look at Samuel, her expression filled with contempt. "I read an article about this," she added. "They wear these costumes to get discounts at restaurants and preferential treatment. It's fraud, really." Samuel felt his face burning with humiliation. He wanted to speak up, to tell them about that terrible day in 1969 when he had risked everything to save his fellow soldiers. He wanted to describe the sound of enemy bullets whizzing past his head as he dragged wounded men to safety. He wanted to explain how he had spent 3 days in a military hospital afterward, being treated for burns and shrapnel wounds. But the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, and he was afraid that if he tried to speak, his voice would crack with emotion. These young people had probably never faced real danger in their lives. They had grown up in comfort and safety, protected by men and women like Samuel, who had sacrificed their youth and innocence so others could live freely. The flight attendant came by with the beverage cart, and Samuel politely asked for water. His mouth felt dry, and his heart was racing from the stress of being the target of so much hostility. As the attendant handed him his drink, one of the college students spoke up loudly enough for her to hear. "Excuse me, does the airline have a policy about people wearing fake military decorations?" the young man asked with false concern. "Because I'm pretty sure that's illegal, and it's making other passengers uncomfortable." The flight attendant looked confused and glanced at Samuel's medal. She was young, probably not much older than the students, and clearly didn't know how to handle the situation. I'm not sure about our specific policy on that," she stammered. "Maybe you should check with the captain," the businessman suggested helpfully. "I mean, if he's impersonating a veteran, that's a federal crime, right? We shouldn't have to sit next to a criminal for the entire flight." Samuel closed his eyes and tried to transport himself somewhere else in his mind. He thought about his late wife, Maria, who had always been so proud of his service. She used to polish his medal before Veterans Day ceremonies, and would beam with pride when people thanked him for his sacrifice. Maria had been gone for 5 years now, and Samuel missed her fierce protectiveness more than ever. The young woman across the aisle pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'm posting about this on social media," she announced. "People need to know what kind of scammers are out there. Maybe someone will recognize him and expose him properly." She held up her phone and appeared to be trying to take a photo of Samuel without his knowledge. The elderly veteran instinctively turned toward the window, trying to hide his face. The movement made his arthritis flare up and he winced in pain, which only seemed to amuse his tormentors further. "Look, he's trying to hide now." The tall student laughed. "Guilty conscience, probably." More passengers were beginning to pay attention to the commotion. Some looked sympathetic but remained silent, unwilling to get involved in what appeared to be a controversial situation. Others seemed to side with the accusers, nodding along with their comments about stolen valor and fake veterans. Samuel felt completely alone, surrounded by dozens of people who had already judged and convicted him, without knowing anything about his story. He thought about getting up and asking to change seats, but the plane was full, and he didn't want to cause more of a scene. Besides, his pride wouldn't let him run away, even though every instinct told him to escape. The metal on his jacket seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds now. He had worn it because Michael had always been so proud of his grandfather's military service. Samuel had thought that wearing it might start conversations with other veterans, maybe even make some new friends during the long flight. Instead, it had made him a target for ridicule and accusations. Unknown to Samuel, however, someone else on the plane had been listening to every word of the harassment. Several rows ahead in business class, the distinguished-looking man in the expensive suit had grown, increasingly angry as he watched the elderly veteran being tormented by passengers who had no idea what real service and sacrifice meant. This man knew exactly what Samuel's Bronze Star represented. He knew the courage it took to earn such a decoration, and the character it took to wear it with quiet dignity, despite being attacked by ignorant strangers. More importantly, he had the power to do something about the injustice he was witnessing. But for now, Samuel sat in his economy seat, surrounded by hostility and disbelief, unaware that his ordeal was about to take a dramatic turn that would restore his faith in humanity and remind him that his service had not been forgotten by everyone. The situation on the aircraft had escalated beyond simple whispered comments and sideways glances. What started as cruel teenagers making jokes had transformed into a coordinated effort to humiliate Samuel Rodriguez in front of the entire cabin. The elderly veteran found himself at the center of a storm of accusations and mockery that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The businessman, who had joined the harassment earlier, now appeared to be leading the charge. He had unbuckled his seatbelt and turned around completely to face Samuel, his voice loud enough to carry throughout the economy section of the plane. "Sir, I think you owe everyone on this flight an explanation," he declared with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "That medal you're wearing, where exactly did you serve to earn it?" Samuel looked up from his book, his weathered hands shaking slightly. The man's aggressive tone and demanding posture reminded him of the interrogations he had endured as a prisoner of war for 3 weeks after his rescue mission went wrong. Back then, he had given only his name, rank, and serial number, just as he had been trained. But this wasn't a military situation, and these weren't enemy soldiers. These were fellow Americans who should have understood the respect owed to those who served. "I served in Vietnam," Samuel replied quietly, his voice barely audible over the airplane's engine noise. The college student who had started the harassment laughed loudly. "Oh, how convenient, Vietnam. Let me guess, you were Special Forces, right? Maybe a Green Beret? Or wait, let me guess. You single-handedly saved your entire platoon and they gave you the Medal of Honor. But you're being modest and only wearing the Bronze Star." His female companion giggled and pulled out her phone to record the confrontation. "This is going to get so many views," she whispered to herself, apparently more concerned with social media fame than the dignity of an elderly man. Samuel's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The young man's sarcastic description was painfully close to what had actually happened. Though Samuel had never bragged about it or sought recognition, he had saved 7 men that day, not an entire platoon, and he had been awarded the Bronze Star with valor, not the Medal of Honor. But explaining that now would only make him sound more like the fake they already believed him to be. The woman in the row ahead had turned around completely and was studying Samuel's medal with the intensity of an art expert examining a forgery. "The ribbon looks wrong," she announced loudly. I looked it up on my phone, and the colors are supposed to be different. "This is definitely fake." Samuel wanted to explain that the ribbon had faded over 50 years of wear, that the original bright colors had been dulled by time and handling. He wanted to tell them about the ceremony where he had received it, how the general's hands had shaken as he pinned it to Samuel's uniform because the general's own son had been killed in Vietnam just weeks earlier. But the words stuck in his throat, blocked by decades of conditioning that taught him to be modest about his service. The flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by what appeared to be a senior crew member. The older woman looked uncomfortable as she approached Samuel's row. "Sir," she began hesitantly, "we've received some complaints from other passengers. They're suggesting that your military decoration might not be authentic." The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight. Samuel felt every eye in the surrounding rows focused on him, waiting for his response. Some passengers had their phones out, apparently recording the confrontation for their own entertainment or social media posts. "Are you calling me a liar?" Samuel asked, his voice stronger now despite the tremor in his hands. The question wasn't directed at the flight attendant, who was clearly just doing her job, but at the passengers who had created this humiliating situation. "Well, if the shoe fits," the businessman said with a smirk. "Look, we've all heard about stolen valor cases. People buy fake medals online and then parade around expecting special treatment. It's insulting to real veterans." The young woman across the aisle waved her phone triumphantly. "I found a website where you can buy exact replicas of any military medal for like $20. The Bronze Star is one of their most popular items because people think it sounds impressive, but isn't too high-ranking to be believable." Samuel felt his chest tighten with pain that had nothing to do with his heart condition. These people had convicted him based on assumptions and internet searches, without knowing anything about his actual service record or the sacrifices he had made. They had no idea that he still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, reliving the explosion that had brought down the helicopter carrying his wounded friends. "Maybe we should move you to a different seat," the senior flight attendant suggested gently. It was clear she was trying to defuse the situation rather than determine the truth of Samuel's service. "Why should he get special treatment?" the college student demanded. "If he's lying about being a veteran, he should be arrested when we land. This is fraud, plain and simple." More passengers were beginning to weigh in with their opinions. Some seemed to agree with the accusers, nodding along with comments about the epidemic of fake veterans seeking attention. Others looked uncomfortable with the public humiliation of an elderly man but remained silent, unwilling to get involved in the controversy. Samuel considered taking off the medal and putting it in his pocket, just to end the harassment. But something inside him rebelled against the idea. He had earned this medal with blood and courage, and he had every right to wear it. His grandfather had told him stories about veterans returning from World War II to parades and celebrations. Samuel's generation had returned from Vietnam to protests and hostility, but he had never expected to face this level of disrespect 50 years later. The businessman was now standing in the aisle, blocking other passengers and drawing even more attention to the situation. "This is exactly what's wrong with our society," he declared, apparently enjoying his role as the moral authority on the plane. No respect for real heroes because fakes like this guy cheapen the meaning of military service. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to find the calm center that had helped him survive combat and captivity. He thought about Maria, who would have been furious at these people for attacking her husband. He thought about Michael, his grandson, who would be so disappointed to learn that people could be this cruel to an elderly veteran. Most of all, he thought about the 7 men he had pulled from that burning helicopter wreckage in 1969. 3 of them were still alive, scattered across the country, living lives that were possible only because a 19-year-old kid from Texas had refused to leave them behind. They knew the truth about his service, even if these strangers refused to believe it. Unknown to Samuel, his ordeal was about to take a dramatic turn. Several rows ahead in business class, a man had been listening to every word of the harassment, with growing anger and determination to set things right. This man knew exactly what Samuel's Bronze Star meant, and he had both the authority and the platform to restore the elderly veteran's dignity in front of everyone who had witnessed his humiliation. The harassment had reached a crescendo when suddenly, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the chaos from the front of the plane. "Excuse me." The words were spoken calmly but with such command that conversation stopped and heads turned throughout the cabin. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s was standing in the business class section, his expensive suit and confident bearing immediately marking him as someone of importance. His silver hair was perfectly groomed and his posture spoke of military training from decades past. Most notably, he wore a small pin on his lapel that careful observers would recognize as indicating high-level government or military service. I couldn't help but overhear this conversation, the man continued, his voice carrying easily through the cabin without shouting, and I feel compelled to address what's happening here. The businessman who had been leading the attack on Samuel looked slightly less confident now, perhaps sensing that the dynamic was about to shift. Sir, we're just trying to protect the honor of real veterans by exposing someone who's clearly... Clearly what? The distinguished man interrupted, his tone growing colder. You're clearly attacking an elderly gentleman based on assumptions and ignorance. May I ask about your own military service? The businessman's face reddened. Well, that's not really relevant here. I'm a patriot who supports our troops, and that's why I can't stand to see people like him making a mockery of military service. I see. So you have no military experience whatsoever, but you've appointed yourself as the authority on who deserves to wear a Bronze Star. The man's words were measured but devastating. How fascinating. The college students who had started the harassment were now looking much less confident. The young man who had been so bold in his accusations was slumping in his seat, apparently realizing that their target might have an unexpected defender. The distinguished man began walking slowly down the aisle toward Samuel's row, and passengers instinctively moved aside to let him pass. As he got closer, Samuel could see the details of the pin on his lapel more clearly. It was a small eagle, indicating service at the highest levels of the military or government. Sir, the man said, addressing Samuel directly with a tone of deep respect. Would you mind if I took a look at your Bronze Star? I'd be honored to examine it. Samuel nodded silently, his hands shaking as he unpinned the medal from his jacket. The distinguished man took it carefully, handling it with the reverence that comes from understanding exactly what such decorations represent. He examined the medal closely, turning it over to look at the back where Samuel's name and service details were engraved. His expression grew more serious as he read the inscription. Bronze Star with Valor Device, awarded to Sergeant Samuel Rodriguez, 1st Infantry Division, for heroic achievement in ground combat against a hostile force in Vietnam. The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even the airplane's engine noise seemed muted as passengers strained to hear every word. The wear patterns on this ribbon are consistent with 50-plus years of age, the man continued, his voice taking on the tone of an expert witness. The oxidation on the bronze is exactly what you'd expect from a genuine medal from that era. Most importantly, the inscription on the back includes details that would be impossible to fake without access to military records. He looked up at the passengers who had been attacking Samuel, his expression stern and disappointed. This is not only authentic, but it represents one of our military's highest honors for valor in combat. The Bronze Star with Valor Device is awarded only to those who have distinguished themselves by heroic or meritorious achievement, while engaged in action against an enemy of the United States. The businessman, who had been so confident earlier, was now completely silent, his face pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The college students looked mortified, apparently understanding for the first time that they had been attacking a genuine war hero. The distinguished man continued his explanation, clearly intending to educate everyone within earshot. To earn this decoration, Sergeant Rodriguez would have had to perform an act of heroism under enemy fire, risking his own life to save others or accomplish a critical mission. The fact that he wears it quietly, without fanfare or expectation of recognition, tells you everything you need to know about his character. He handed the medal back to Samuel with both hands, a gesture of respect that wasn't lost on anyone watching. Thank you for your service, Sergeant, and please accept my apology on behalf of anyone who questioned your honor, without understanding what they were looking at. Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he pinned the medal back to his jacket. For the first time in hours, he felt the weight of respect and recognition that should have been his from the beginning. Thank you, sir, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. The distinguished man turned to address the broader cabin, his voice now carrying a tone of disappointment and instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed here today is exactly what's wrong with our society's treatment of veterans. We have a generation of Americans who are so disconnected from military service that they can't recognize genuine heroism. When it's sitting right next to them, he looked directly at the businessman who had led the attack. Instead of automatically assuming the worst about someone wearing military decorations, perhaps you might consider showing respect first and asking questions later. Better yet, you might simply say thank you for your service and leave it at that. The college students looked like they wanted to disappear into their seats. The young woman who had been filming the harassment had put her phone away, apparently realizing that her video would now show her participating in the public humiliation of a war hero. Veterans of Sergeant Rodriguez's generation sacrificed their youth, their health, and in many cases their lives so that you could enjoy the freedoms you take for granted, the man continued. The least we can do is treat them with the dignity and respect they've earned. The cabin remained silent as the distinguished man prepared to return to his seat. But Samuel reached out and gently touched his arm. "Sir, may I ask who you are? I want to know who stood up for me when no one else would." The man smiled and extended his hand for a firm handshake. "Robert Harrison. I'm the president and CEO of this airline, and it's my honor to meet you, Sergeant Rodriguez." The revelation sent a shockwave through the cabin. Passengers who had been silent during the harassment now looked embarrassed and ashamed. The businessman who had been so vocal in his accusations looked like he might be sick. The college students appeared to be questioning every assumption they had made about the elderly veteran. Samuel felt a surge of vindication and gratitude unlike anything he had experienced since coming home from Vietnam. Finally, someone with authority and knowledge had recognized his service and defended his honor. The president of the airline had stood up for him when his fellow passengers had torn him down. The revelation that Robert Harrison was the airline's president sent ripples of shock and embarrassment throughout the cabin. Passengers who had remained silent during Samuel's harassment now understood the full weight of what they had witnessed, while those who had participated in the attack looked like they wished they could disappear entirely. Harrison wasn't finished, however. As the president and CEO of one of the nation's largest airlines, he commanded respect and attention wherever he went. More importantly, as a former Air Force officer himself, he understood both the sacrifice that Samuel's medal represented and the obligation to honor that sacrifice properly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of both his corporate position and his military background, "I want everyone on this aircraft to understand exactly what just happened here. You've been sharing this cabin with a genuine American hero, and instead of showing him the respect he deserves, some of you chose to attack and humiliate him." The businessman who had led the harassment attempt looked physically ill. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that his behavior had been witnessed by someone who could potentially affect his career and reputation. He opened his mouth as if to apologize, but Harrison held up a hand to stop him. "Before anyone attempts to offer excuses or apologies, I want you to hear Sergeant Rodriguez's story," Harrison continued, "because understanding what this man did for our country might help you think differently before you attack the next veteran you encounter." Harrison had clearly done his homework in the few minutes since examining Samuel's medal. As an airline executive, he had access to resources and databases that allowed him to verify military records quickly. What he had discovered about Samuel's service had only increased his respect for the elderly veteran. On March 15, 1969, Sergeant Rodriguez was part of a rescue operation in the Mekong Delta region of Vietnam. Harrison began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a military briefing. When their helicopter was shot down by enemy fire, 7 soldiers were trapped in the burning wreckage. Rather than seeking cover, Sergeant Rodriguez crawled through active enemy fire to reach his wounded comrades. The cabin was absolutely silent now. Even the flight attendants had stopped their service to listen to Harrison's account. Samuel himself looked surprised that anyone would know such specific details about his service, details he had never shared with strangers. For 45 minutes, while under constant enemy fire, Sergeant Rodriguez made multiple trips between the helicopter wreckage and a defensive position, carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Harrison continued. He saved 7 lives that day, suffering burns and shrapnel wounds in the process. 3 weeks later, he was captured during another mission and spent nearly a month as a prisoner of war before being rescued. Several passengers gasped audibly at this revelation. The college students who had started the harassment looked mortified, apparently beginning to understand the magnitude of the man they had been mocking. The young woman who had been filming put her hands over her face in shame. "This is what a Bronze Star with Valor device represents," Harrison explained, gesturing toward Samuel's medal. "It's not given out for participation or showing up. It's awarded only to those who demonstrate extraordinary heroism under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Sergeant Rodriguez earned this medal by risking everything to save the lives of his fellow soldiers." Harrison paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "And today, instead of receiving the gratitude and respect he deserves, this American hero was subjected to accusations, mockery, and humiliation by people who have probably never faced any real danger in their comfortable lives." The businessman who had been so vocal earlier finally found his voice, though it was much quieter now. "Mr. Harrison, I had no idea. I was just trying to—" He trailed off, apparently realizing that no excuse could justify his behavior. "You were trying to what?" Harrison asked pointedly. "Protect the honor of military service by attacking someone who actually served with honor. You were so eager to expose a fake veteran that you didn't bother to consider that you might be wrong." Harrison turned his attention to the college students who had started the entire incident. "And you two, what's your excuse? Did it make you feel superior to mock an elderly man? Did it give you some kind of thrill to humiliate someone who could be your grandfather?" The young man who had been so bold earlier looked like he might cry. "Sir, we thought, we didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Harrison replied firmly. "You made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance, and then you acted on those assumptions without any regard for the dignity of another human being." Harrison walked over to stand directly next to Samuel's row, placing his hand on the elderly veteran's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and respect. "I want everyone on this aircraft to take a good look at this man. His name is Samuel Rodriguez, and he's a genuine American hero. He volunteered to serve his country when it needed him most, fought in one of our most difficult wars, and came home to a society that didn't appreciate his sacrifice." The airline president's voice grew more emotional as he continued. 50 years later, he's still facing disrespect and suspicion from people who enjoy the freedoms he helped protect. This is not acceptable, and it's not the America that Sergeant Rodriguez fought to defend. Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. He wrote something quickly and handed the paper to Samuel. "Sergeant, I'm upgrading you to first class for the remainder of this flight, and I'm providing you with lifetime platinum status on our airline. It's the least we can do to show our appreciation for your service." Samuel looked down at the paper with tears in his eyes. He had never expected such recognition, especially after the humiliation he had endured. "Sir, that's very generous, but it's not necessary." "It's absolutely necessary," Harrison interrupted. "And it's long overdue. You should never have to pay for another flight with this airline. Your service to our country has earned you that and much more." Harrison turned back to address the cabin one final time. "I want everyone here to remember this moment. Remember that heroes don't always look like what you expect. They're often elderly people sitting quietly in economy class, wearing faded medals that represent more courage than most of us will ever possess." He looked directly at the passengers who had participated in the harassment. "And remember that your words and actions have consequences. Today you attacked a man who deserves your respect and gratitude. I hope you'll think about that the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances and assumptions." The transformation in the cabin was remarkable. Passengers who had been hostile or indifferent now looked at Samuel with obvious respect and admiration. Some were openly crying as they processed the story of his heroism and the shame of his treatment. Harrison gestured to a flight attendant. "Please help Sergeant Rodriguez gather his belongings and escort him to seat 2A, and make sure he has everything he needs for the remainder of the flight." As Samuel stood to move to first class, something unexpected happened. One passenger began to clap, then another, and then another. Within moments, the entire economy section was giving Samuel a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the cabin like thunder. The elderly veteran stood in the aisle, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of respect and appreciation. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt the honor and recognition that his service deserved. The journey that had begun with humiliation was transforming into something beautiful and healing. Samuel Rodriguez adjusted his worn leather jacket as he walked through the bustling airport terminal. At 73 years old, his steps were slower than they once were, but his back remained straight with the dignity that came from decades of military service. The small bronze medal pinned to his jacket caught the fluorescent lights overhead, though most people hurrying past barely noticed the elderly man making his way to Gate B12. The medal wasn't much to look at compared to the flashy jewelry and designer accessories worn by other travelers. It was simple, tarnished with age, and attached to a faded ribbon that had seen better days. But to Samuel it represented the most important moment of his life, a moment that had changed him forever and saved the lives of 7 fellow soldiers during the Vietnam War. Samuel had been drafted at 19, fresh out of high school in a small Texas town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He wasn't particularly brave or strong, just an ordinary young man who loved baseball and helped his father fix cars in their garage. The war seemed like something happening in a distant world until the letter arrived, summoning him to serve his country. The flight to Los Angeles was part of a journey he had been planning for months. His grandson Michael was graduating from college, the first in their family to earn a degree. Samuel had promised to be there no matter what. The old veteran had saved every penny from his modest pension to afford the plane ticket, choosing to fly rather than drive because his arthritis made long car trips too painful. As he settled into his economy seat, Samuel noticed the looks from other passengers. Some seemed annoyed by how slowly he moved down the aisle. Others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps wondering why an old man was traveling alone. A few young business travelers rolled their eyes when he took extra time storing his small carry-on bag overhead. The seat next to him was occupied by a well-dressed woman in her 40s who immediately pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Across the aisle, 2 college-age students snickered as they watched Samuel struggle slightly with his seatbelt. The buckle was different from the ones he was used to, and his fingers weren't as nimble as they once were. "Need help there, Grandpa?" one of the students called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His friend laughed and pointed at Samuel's medal. "Nice costume jewelry. Did you get that at a thrift store?" Samuel's face flushed red, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially with people who couldn't possibly understand what real fighting meant. Instead, he quietly fastened his seatbelt and opened the small paperback book he had brought for the flight. The woman next to him glanced over and noticed the title, a biography of soldiers who served in Vietnam. She wrinkled her nose slightly and shifted away as if the topic might be contagious. Behind them, a businessman talking loudly on his phone complained about being seated near some old guy with his war medals, who was probably going to tell boring stories the whole flight. More passengers continued boarding, and the comments grew bolder. A group of young professionals near the back made jokes about stolen valor and questioned whether the medal was even real. They speculated about whether Samuel was just an old man seeking attention, wearing military decorations he hadn't earned. The flight attendants were too busy with their pre-flight duties to notice the growing tension. Samuel tried to focus on his book, but the words blurred together as memories of Vietnam flooded back. He remembered the jungle heat, the constant fear, the faces of friends who never made it home. Most of all, he remembered the day that earned him the Bronze Star with Valor, the day he crawled through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers from a burning helicopter. As the plane filled up, Samuel noticed a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit walking down the aisle. The man moved with confidence and purpose, nodding politely to flight attendants who seemed to recognize him. He took a seat several rows ahead, in the business class section that Samuel could never afford. The elderly veteran closed his eyes and tried to block out the whispers and snickers around him. He thought about Michael, his grandson who had always looked up to him and never questioned the stories about his military service. Michael believed in him, respected him, and that was enough. That had to be enough. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would begin taxiing shortly. Samuel gripped his book tighter and prepared for what he assumed would be a long, uncomfortable flight filled with sideways glances and whispered comments about the old man with the fake medal. He had no idea that everything was about to change. He couldn't have known that the distinguished man in business class had been watching and listening to everything that happened. Most importantly, Samuel had no way of knowing that this man would soon stand up and transform his humiliating experience into one of the most meaningful moments of his life. The plane began to move away from the gate, and Samuel stared out the small window at the ground crew below. He wondered if he had made a mistake coming on this trip. Maybe he should have just sent Michael a card and stayed home. The metal on his jacket suddenly felt heavier, like a burden rather than an honor. But sometimes the most important moments in life come when we least expect them. Sometimes respect and recognition arrive from the most unlikely sources, and sometimes one person's courage to stand up for what's right can change everything for someone who has quietly carried their pain for far too long. The journey was just beginning, and Samuel Rodriguez was about to discover that his service to his country, and the sacrifice it represented, had not been forgotten by everyone after all.